trying to avoid legal problems when we can.
Yeah, these are the things you don't think about until you've had to for some unfortunate reason. This meeting is now officially recorded. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Okay, so I just threw a couple of things in here to give a little bit of background to people on the call. And I noticed some of the, Ryan, you're here. I was hoping John Gossman was going to come today, but I don't see him on the call. So earlier this year, we as in Google and several other companies sort of got together and tried to figure out how we're going to improve open source security together. The outcome of that is the new Open Source Security Foundation. One of the things that a lot of these companies were particularly excited about was actually proactively going in and doing like remediation work or helping out projects that could use a bunch of extra support when it comes to security. We had a bunch of working sessions together, and we talked about this idea a lot and what it could look like, sort of what's been done before, like how do we learn from what's been done before and apply it either differently or learn from it. We came up with a cool name, and I copied it here, called like the Fire Team. So the idea is that open source projects that need help could have access to a shared pool of resources, engineering resources, and we called them the Fire Team, the Free Incident Response Engineers. And the idea is, they could move from project to project and then help out that way. And so, one of the things that we discussed with companies is that, we're all sort of, if there's a security issue or something, we're all sort of fixing the same thing. So there's a lot of duplicative effort, and it would be great if we didn't have to do that and we had like one concerted effort to go in and help things. Then another thing that we talked about, and we can talk about this, is like, how are we going to identify which projects actually need support? And so we talked a bit about, trying to come up with a way to define the top, say, 1,000 critical projects, open source projects. Yeah. This is where, I asked David, and he's going to do a little discussion on the CII, and this is where some of the work that the Linux Foundation has been doing with Harvard in the Census 2 work that I think could come in handy, but really curious, to talk about that with other companies. If, we talked to a few companies and they're like, yeah, we have a list of 100 open source projects that are critical and that we want to make sure are secure. And so that would be a good discussion topic for us. And then the next thing is like, what improvements would we actually make to these projects? Is there something we could sort of collectively agree on and go and start tackling alone? And then, so we were interested in funding an effort like this with real money. Unfortunately, COVID sort of came upon us, and then budgets were shrinking a lot, so we weren't able to make as much progress on this as we wanted to yet. But that was the spirit. Like, there's a whole bunch of critical open source projects that that don't have as many eyeballs as they need right now, and sometimes even at Google, it's hard to like actually get that stuff prioritized and convince like an engineer to sort of work on some random one-off package, but even though we all sort of depend on it. So that's kind of a bit of the background how this came about. And then we spun up the Open Source Security Foundation, and then we bootstrapped it with this working group, and that was sort of the intention of the working group and what we're hoping to do. So so that's a bit of background. We can go on to David's presentation now, or we can discuss a little bit. How about, David, how about you present on CII if people aren't too familiar? Nico, do you want to?
Okay.
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead, David. I did actually have a specific sort of insight from CII from a few years ago, specifically around that sort of selection of projects thing, which I think is a precursor to any other discussion. When we were doing the CII 5-6 years ago, one of the things that was specific, the Core Infrastructure Initiative, sorry, Christina, the Core Infrastructure Initiative was a project that was set up by the Linux Foundation, more or less in the wake of Heartbleed, when suddenly everybody in industry who thought that they weren't using open source software in their code base suddenly realized that actually they were using open source software all over their code base. One of the things that came up in the early discussions was, how does one limit the scope? And what constitutes infrastructure? Because the goal was really to try and provide a way to better secure the development of infrastructural bits of software. And it varies enormously depending on what part of the stack you're looking at. If you look at a typical piece of JavaScript, the transitive closure of all of the JavaScript packages that get sucked in is enormous. Whereas if you look at a piece of Go or Rust, it tends to be, the span at any given node is much smaller, and so the total transitive closure is much smaller. And if you look at the big components, Kubernetes relies on a bunch of other bits, but actually a surprisingly small number of them compared to your typical web page. So I think that if one's working at the critical word is critical in this discussion, because we can't necessarily expect to secure every JavaScript project on npm or every Python package on PyPy, and so we've got to sort of work out where do we limit our scope, and so I think that that's something that this organization needs to sort of make a decision about relatively early on, if it's going to, before we can get our arms around the problem.
Right.
So that's just
yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah. So if I can jump in here. So back when Nico was leading the CII, I actually worked for. I actually supported him. We did an early study which was called CII Census 1, where we analyzed primarily packages within Linux distros to try to help identify what was critical within them. Since the time after Nico moved on, much more recently, just a few months ago, Harvard released what we're calling CII Census 2. This is continuing work from the CII, where they analyzed dependencies at the language package level, JavaScript and so on, and identified what they believe, and using dependency data and data from two SCA organizations, that software component. Software component, depending on how you define it, but basically it's the software components. Folks who analyze that. And I'll get the link for that. We can put that in this little document for notes, or actually somebody else can just Google and look it up. It shouldn't be hard to find. One of the other things that the CII did, two other things. One of the important things to do is, after you identify critical projects, what do you do about them? Kim's already mentioned that, hey, go audit, go review. One of the other things that the CII determined was that there was no way it could do everything for everybody. So they kicked off this CII Best Practices badge, basically a way to identify what projects should be doing, and that was something that could be replicated broadly, so that you can focus funds on some specific projects, and you can go broad. And very soon we start requiring that even for the ones that we're specifically funding, because if you don't have version control systems and you don't have any tests, you don't have a test framework, maybe it's time to discover those. And if you won't want to discover those, that's fine. We're not funding you. So I think that also tended to be helpful. Kim and I talked earlier. The folks who led the second census project, actually were from Harvard. I would propose that we try to bring them on in a follow-up meeting. I can talk briefly about the best practices badge, but it's what I had a slide deck for. But I'll give you just the quick rundown. in case that could be helpful, and then we can move on. Does that sound like a reasonable thing to do?
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful.
Okay, so let me, I am going to just.
I have a question. Sorry. Can we just
Sure.
back up a bit? So you
Sure.
said, if you don't have CI, if you don't have tests, we're not funding you. So does the Core Infrastructure Initiative actually provide funding? Who is we
Yes.
in this case?
I'm sorry, the we in this case was the CII. The CII actually funded a number of projects, including OpenSSL, to basically fix up some serious long-term problems. OpenSSL wasn't getting widespread review, and one of the, we can talk about the changes that were done, but for example, if you ever tried to look at the OpenSSL code, it was a masterpiece of confusion. They had, it had built up technical debt like nobody's business, and and made some decisions that really should never have been made. So yes, so the CI actually funded work to evaluate projects, to fix them, to make various changes. And we did require things like, we'll give you funding, but you've got to use a version control system. That's just a non-starter if you can't, and you got to share what you're doing as you do it, because the surprise, here's 50,000 new lines of code, good luck, is not a good model for collaborative review.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yes. And then also, how would people go about pursuing this funding, or is it kind of like a pull model instead of a push model?
Okay. Nicker can talk about this as well. We probably have slightly different opinions. There were there were multiple different ways. There was both an analysis from the CII. Hey, what's important to fund? And then basically its governing board decided what to fund. There was also a grant model where people could make requests. Now, Nico, you may not have the same opinion as I do, but in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I think the grant model in the short term was a mistake. And the reason was, it made sense because governments do this all the time. Hey, make proposals. But in my experience, the projects that needed it the help the most were the ones who tended to not show up and make requests. And so it took a lot of time to review grant proposals.
I'm inclined to agree with you there, David. I think that well, actually, I'm in two minds. I think that we had some very useful grant applications that we granted to. The flow, I think the biggest problem with the grant process was that the lot of important projects didn't know that they could come to us for grants, and
yes.
We tried doing a fair amount of outreach. I think when we did outreach, we actually often got people applying for grants, but we also got people saying, I have no idea how to write a grant proposal. So there was a fair amount of back and forth with the CII board about what the right way to do this was, because there were several people who felt like we shouldn't be giving people grant money unless they'd written a good grant application. And so Marcus Streets, who also worked for the CII back then, spent a fair amount of time talking people through the process of writing grant applications so that they could apply. On the other hand, I sort of feel like just giving money away to people that we think are the right people, you then end up having to use a bit of a stick to try and make sure that they use the money in an appropriate way. And when we did say, we want you to use this money for, putting in place a continuous integration system, or putting in place various tools which we think will be useful, we tended to get a fair amount of pushback from projects saying, well, that's not the way we do things. The Network Time Foundation was a case in point, to the point that we we stopped funding the Network Time Foundation pretty early on, and then we.
Yeah, Nico, careful, you're getting recorded. Carry on.
Well, it's true, and I think it's in the note in the meeting minutes that were published. So,
Okay.
and then we stopped funding the NTPsec project for other reasons. In the end, Crony came along and saved the day because it's a vastly better written network time service, and so
Yep.
I think
CII
these days
funded that, I believe.
and so we
Yeah.
we didn't fund its development, but we funded its security audit, which demonstrated that it was a significantly better thing. And I think one of the things that we did do, which was quite valuable in a number of cases, was going to projects which we felt were important, but who didn't think that they needed a lot of operational help, and funded security analyses so that they could highlight the good and bad in the project and work out what to do next from a security standpoint.
Okay,
but,
so anyway, I'm not saying that grants could never work. It's just I think it's often very helpful to look at your options, evaluate, see what's going on, and look at your options. Otherwise, it takes a lot of time to run a grant program. So let me. I had promised Kim just a few minutes, and I think we're running short. So let me just talk about what the badge is. Just one thing she asked me to talk about, and I will do this lickety split. So this is the other thing, was we were encouraging projects to get some good practices, because a lot of problems could be fixed or at least reduced in impact if they just did some rational things. So as already mentioned, Heartbleed kicked off CII. How folks actually develop the software matters. Doesn't mean that good people are unimportant, but we want people to do reasonable things. And so we identified a bunch of best practices for the production of open source software, and have a little web application where projects can self-certify. There is some automation in there to fill in answers and verify them. And we also present the answers so that people can critique the various claims. It's a little web application, and in fact, it earns its own badge, which I think is important. If nothing else, if you're involved in an open source project, I'd encourage everybody to go to the website Best Practices Core Infrastructure org, get a badge. These are some of the projects with badges. Lots and lots of folks: Linux kernel, LibreOffice, GitLab, Kubernetes. I think my video. Okay. This is slightly old. There's over 3,300 projects participating now, and over 450 at least have earned at least the passing level badge. There's actually three badge levels: passing, silver, gold. You have to meet the lower levels to get the higher ones. Silver was designed so it's possible for a one-person project, though it's difficult. And gold, really, you have to have multiple developers. There's just a lot of one-person projects, which is why it was divided this way. The whole thing's, all the criteria were designed to be reasonable, not hypocritical. We're focused not on academic, somebody thinks it's a good idea, but what projects find actually works. We very much do not require any particular technology, any particular service. It never requires proprietary software, though you can use it. And the goal is not to take over projects, and people can do things incrementally. So here's a couple examples of what those look like. Hey, does your website succinctly describe what the software does? You have to have at least one automated tool suite. You have to use at least one static code analysis tool. You have to support HTTPS for your website and repo. You have to publish the process for reporting vulnerabilities. By the way, that's the number one problem right now, is for projects which aren't quite passing yet, is they're not telling anybody how to report vulnerabilities. We have a scoring system so that you can combine those. And here's some miscellaneous information. Okay, so I was trying to do that as quickly as possible because I realized we're running short on time. Questions?
I saw one in the chat from Dan.
Oh, okay.
What about the funding from? Oh, sorry.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wanted to wrap back to part of that learning the lessons from the last funding models. So you talked a lot about the grant money, but the other model where the board or whomever had directed funds to specific projects. Could you say a little bit more about what worked or didn't work with that one?
I think that the pushback we tended to get was that it was similar in that we did have a number of projects where they felt like us giving them money to do a specific set of activities was commercial interference, because CII was funded by 20 major companies who'd all put in a bunch of money at the beginning. There was a perception that this was sort of commercial companies telling them what to do. And, so having, Google and Microsoft are telling us that we need to do X. And so we did see a little bit of a pushback of that, because I think the board felt, quite reasonably, that we weren't going to give people money, just toss it over the wall and see what happens. We were going to give people money to do things that we felt were necessary. I think probably the key, the main project where we didn't really put any strings attached because we felt they were doing it quite right already was with the Reproducible Builds project, which was a Debian project to ensure that when you build a Debian package, according to the script, you end up with a binary identical package if you build from the same source. They were just, it was a sensible thing to do, and they were doing it right, and so we didn't put many constraints on them. But certainly with the OpenSSL Foundation, well, the OpenSSL team, prior to them having a foundation, I think we got a fair amount of pushback saying, well, you're just making us do stuff that we didn't want to do. Eventually we got over those humps, but I think that was sort of the biggest problem that we had with the board deciding whom they want to give money to, was that we didn't just decide whom we wanted to give money to, but what we wanted them to use it for. And so people perceive that as strings.
I think they were strings. On the other hand, I don't think that was unreasonable.
They were all strings pulling in the right direction.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's, in many ways, it's much easier to view this as a negotiation. After you find out you got a problem, you need to do something about it. Just sending money with no strings, I think, is actually, unless you're very, very confident they're already going to head the right direction, I think is actually important, even though it was negatively perceived by some. I think in the end, they did take the money with the strings, and positive things occurred from it. I think in some cases, and I think that's going to be the experience of OpenSSF as well, personalities matter. Have I said that politically nicely? There are some projects which are very important, written and managed by people who are a little prickly. They're used to doing their own thing. And it's not necessarily wrong because they've managed to succeed in doing something the way they've always done it. And so I think it's helpful to go in with a mindset of, this is a negotiation. We want you to do X because it's important. We're willing to pay you $Y. And I think it did take some doing, and I think in several cases, surprisingly more for things that I think most of us right here in this meeting would have expected would be, well, of course you would do that. And for them, the idea of doing version control or writing a test was beyond the pale. And no, it's not beyond the pale. It's perfectly reasonable. Everybody else does it. And eventually we did manage to get some folks to do things because it was important to us and we're willing to pay them for it.
So David, I think if I might chime in here, and maybe this is a transition to where Tim started the conversation, is, when you talk about, giving funding to the existing maintainers of a project, the real challenge there is coaxing them into changing how they're running their project. What we found in some other project communities is that hiring somebody or paying somebody to go and work on what needs to be done, sometimes somebody else coming in to actually do that work can be more effective, because usually the existing maintainers know it'd be nice to do that. They just don't have the time to do it. And so just throwing more on their plate and saying, we'll give you a little extra money for it, it's just like, okay, well, I'll do maybe a little bit extra in my nighttime, but, it's a constraint. So I think, the fire team concept was interesting to me when I heard about it, because, it's something that really puts the onus on certain people to go and help clean up and fix certain things without necessarily burdening the existing maintainers in an unnecessary or forceful way. So I don't know.
I think go ahead, Christina. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say that even the framing that they might not want to do it or it's a low priority is I think wrong, because writing good tests, for example, is extremely difficult. It's something that people specialize in their careers. And someone that's writing, low-level kernel drivers is not specialized in writing a comprehensive test suite. So yeah, just +1 to having someone kind of go in and take care of that, who has that knowledge and knows how to do that.
Mike or Christina, have you seen examples of that? That was my question too. If we've tried approaches, we're actually offering up, resources as opposed to just throwing money over the wall.
So yeah, we do it, but we do it. I guess I wouldn't say we do it so overtly. We don't say, hey, we're paying X person to come and fix your code base. What we generally do is show up and we have somebody make contributions, and we make contributions to various projects all the time, through people that we deem can help solve the problem. For example, in real-time Linux, we hired an outside firm that had specialty in real-time problems to go and fix up a lot of the real-time kernel code base and make those contributions. But they didn't come in and change the community. Some of them were already part of that community. But we had new people coming in to help clean up some of that. In automotive technologies, for example, the automotive makers had a number of issues when they started deploying Linux in cars. We hired contractors to go and do that work, and they didn't show up as hey, the Linux Foundation blessed us to change the Linux kernel. They showed up and we're basically making contributions to Linux kernel, just like anybody else would.
And another example of that was we gave a actually rather small grant to a guy who had offered to spend some time going through the 17,000 warnings issued by Coverity when you run it on the Linux kernel, and fixing all the false positives to improve the signal-to-noise ratio of static analysis, which was a hugely worthwhile project. And all he did was, submit patches and with an explanation of what issues were being fixed by them. And I think that, over the course of a year, he fixed 5,000 out of the 17,000, and he was planning to go and fix the other 8,000 that he thought were also false positives. So it was amazingly prolific. He was in fact writing some interesting tools for automating the removal of false positives. So that was actually worthwhile research to fund as well.
And Nico, I think with Google's support, we actually were able to pay him full time to do that.
Awesome.
Now.
Good. That was after I left. Yeah.
After you left, we were paying him to full time, just do nothing but come through those issues in the kernel.
Yay.
Yeah. So if I could tie this up in a bow, as it were, I think identifying this, the critical projects is critically important, but we also need to make sure that there's a next step, because if we just say, oh, look, there's a problem. And I would go further and say that the exact model is going to probably vary from project to project. I do agree with Mike that in many cases, just hiring somebody separately to work on it doesn't have to be part of that core team, can be just another contributor. It can be an awesome way to work. In the other cases, it may be more effective to hire somebody in the core team, or pay them in some way. So I'm sure that the answers vary, but being flexible and talking to folks about figuring out what's the real problem and how do we fix that, I think is key.
Just to keep pulling on that thread a little bit, like what other types of, I guess what we're kind of getting at is like we'd end up with some kind of menu of services, we could offer projects, whether it's funding, infrastructure credits, actual full-time employees to go do a task, expert consultations on specific security things. Like what other kind of, this brainstorming exercise alive, what other things can we think of that projects might look for? And obviously we have to run this by actual projects too.
Yeah, if I could chime in, I thought some really good points were made about, a lot of these projects, they're so focused on the core project itself, they don't have time for things like finding grants or finding resources and things like that. And that's certainly been the case with what we've seen at OSTIF, where, when we help these organizations procure, high quality audit resources, there's so much coordination that goes into that. And I think personally, at least based on our experience and based on the research from things like 0 Days, Thousands of Nights, where really going in depth and having a well-scoped, correctly scoped, deep dive audit performed by experts who have published research in this field or have expertise in a particular field, kind of going back to Christina's point as well. We found that to be the most effective in terms of getting the most bang for your buck, so to speak. So I would definitely, advocate for those kinds of well-scoped, in-depth audits to be done for some of these critical projects.
I agree very much with you, Amir, but I think that there's also another step that comes before that, which is for the lower hanging fruit. One of the things that, the Linux Foundation's done a ton of research over the years, which showed about how the strength of the community around a project is critical in the success of an open source project. One of the things that we discovered in a lot of discussions through the CII was that often, if you go through the best practice badge list, there's nothing on that list that people will say, oh my God, well, we never want to do that. I mean, these are all no-brainer things. But if you've got a project where, there's somebody waving the flag for performance, and there's somebody waving the flag for scalability, and there's somebody waving the flag for new features, and there's somebody waving flag for UX, if there's nobody there waving the flag for security, then no matter how well-intentioned everybody is, it percolates to the bottom of the list. And so I actually wonder whether one of the valuable things that we could do with this project is have a team of people who are just community evangelists for security. And you have people who are charged with taking on a handful of projects and being the squeaky wheel for security in those projects. And I actually think that could have more of an impact overall on a lot of these projects than paying for an audit, which is a big expensive exercise to do well. And so I just think in terms of bang for the buck, just getting people who care about security to be actively involved in the projects that we care about the security of would be potentially very valuable.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point as well. Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's the people that are the most valuable. Yeah. So with the community, yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, I know in the open, of course, the OpenSSF just got off the ground, but there's a number of other working groups too. And I think David's put together some training stuff. So I think this is all in the scope of what we want to do as a foundation, at least. So we only have 9 minutes left. We didn't get to all the discussion stuff. We can table that for next time. But I think, to me, a couple of things that I feel like we can get started on right away, and one is working on defining those critical projects. So as soon as we could get those Harvard folks in here, David, I think that would be really helpful. I think last time I heard about it, they actually needed more data because more data is better. So I'm not sure if they could go into that, and if there's a way some of us on the call could come together and sort of help with that. It might be an interesting discussion.
Do you want to try to have them meet sooner than a month? Would that be of help?
Maybe. I don't mind scheduling another one of these, depending on their schedule. And then the other thing we were just thinking of is if, we actually just started getting feedback from maintainers about like what would be on their wish list, like the top 10 to 20 things, and from a security standpoint. So, and that could give us some ideas of how, this this service might work once we have the funding ready to go. So those are some of the next steps that I took away from this meeting. Because we can't go fix things until we identify what needs to be fixed first. Yeah, any other?
I have a question about that identification process, because from what I've heard described, it sounds like it's sort of a dependency analysis tool chain. My question is, like, how do you identify things that are used over a network? Because that also seems important. So like an example, which probably isn't super important to secure because I think it's already secure and there are processes around it, but just as an example, like Let's Encrypt's Boulder certificate authority is run by one organization really in one place, but we all depend on it.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious what that algorithm is to decide what exactly is critical, right? Because like you just said, an app, criticality for an app versus a network service is very, very different things, right? And then if we're looking at popularity and like components that are used in apps, that doesn't necessarily define critical, right? That something could be used by every single project on the planet or every single app on the planet, but it's to like help you format a string and it's not super critical, right? So I just want to know kind of what that calculation looks like, because in the past I've written scanners for apps to determine like middleware components and things, but that's just popularity, right? So what's that next step of defining security and criticality?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the Harvard folks did not consider network criticality. That doesn't mean it couldn't be done. It just means that the analysis they did up to this point did not. But I think really the better thing to do would be let them talk about and defend their algorithm.
Awesome.
I ran the first one, so I could tell you about that one. But I think no matter what, there's always going to be a challenge. I'd like to view this in some sense as you do the best you can. Whatever you work on from there, is going to be important, and by some definition.
Yeah, I think having done a number of criticality studies, like with the one with Harvard and we've done with the one with CI, I think we'll find that it's really up to this group to define what's critical to you in terms of what do you all want to work on solving for, and back into what do you need to test and look for. The Harvard study looked at production software that was scanned by software component analysis firms. So they're looking at software that's going into real live commercial systems and identifying what components of open source software were used in those. The census one that David worked on looked at the Debian distribution as a prototypical Linux distribution and said which are the packages that are most widely used and have network facing and sudo access and all of those things that could present a security footprint nightmare. And so there's different ways of defining it. And so I think it's just up to this group to figure out, what do you want to define as, what is critical open source to you? And then, how do you go and tackle and address it once you sort of have scoped that? Because I don't think you can scope everything. Just looking at some of the reports on the JavaScript dependency trees, it'll just make your head explode. But, that's just one sort of use case to focus on around the JavaScript side. Then there's the infrastructure side. There's Let's Encrypt or other systems out there that you're all dependent upon for time and other things. So,
if I could jump here real quickly, I think there's a triage step between these two, where after you identify the critical ones, some frankly are in much better shape than others. And I suspect in many cases you'll want to figure out not just what's critical, but what's critical and in trouble.
Yeah, I was going to mention kind of the same thing, is that I think there's step one is identifying criticality for a couple of different use cases, apps versus services versus whatever, right? And then triaging those. And then the next step is also kind of leading into these fire teams, right? What does the response look like should an incident occur in either one of these components? Because it's going to be different for an app versus a service, right? So I think we need to define categories as well as what our criteria is for defining criticality and security issues.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And also to your point, Mike, about defining what's critical. I think at the end of the day, it's, what's most important to us, what's most important to me or my organization or our technology suite. But a good example, going back to Let's Encrypt, because you brought it up, and it could be kind of like a smaller kind of case study of this bigger problem we're talking about. We actually worked with Let's Encrypt last year because Unbound DNS that they use very heavily was kind of an external piece that was kind of out of their control, and it was identified that that's very important to their operations, and so we were able to coordinate a audit of that and find, I believe it was 1 critical and 5 high vulnerabilities, which I'm happy to share those results with you guys, but or with everybody. But it's just a good example. Like, all those classes of bugs are now essentially closed as a result of that review. And we can say, obviously you can't say for certain that it's secure, but we could say with pretty decent assurance that it was reviewed and we found these issues, and we can say that it's much more secure now as a result.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for attending the first inaugural kickoff meeting here. I think next steps are to start working on defining those critical projects. So David, let's see if we can get Harvard to do a presentation in 2 weeks. And then I think, as next steps for folks that are interested in this, like we could do some smaller working group sessions to hammer this out, and then go from there. So.
Let's do it. Sounds good.
Cool.
Okay.
Right. Nice meeting you all, and hope you guys have a good day.
And Kim, are you going to send out a meeting invitation for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or?
I'll work with David on that and figure out when those Harvard people might be available, and then try to probably schedule something around the same time if possible.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.